by the sports department of CBS News.
Stay tuned for special interviews with Vice President Nixon and Governor Rockefeller as CBS News continues its comprehensive coverage of the Republican Convention, next on the CBS television network.
Don't let romance fade, fade, fade away because of...
Good evening from CBS News Convention Headquarters in Chicago. Walter Cronkite reporting. Well, this day, 48 hours before the opening of the Republican National Convention here, has provided one surprise and a number of ensuing developments. Vice President Nixon, the 99 44/100% certain presidential nominee of this party, met for 8 hours with New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller at the Rockefeller apartment in New York City. That meeting broke up at about 3:30 this morning. It ended with a declaration of agreement on the party's platform that seemed to give more points to the Rockefeller liberalism than to Nixon's viewpoint, and party conservatives are up in arms here. The first public performance to follow that private meeting in New York occurred here in Chicago. Reporters, apprised and surprised, it might be said, at the overnight development, were anxious for more details, naturally, especially for any hints as to vice presidential possibilities that might have come out of that New York meeting. And so when reporters met the Vice President's news secretary, Herb Klein, the following exchange occurred.
Subject of the vice presidential nomination did enter into the conversation. It entered into it rather casually. The vice president again expressed his published view that he in no way would attempt to pressure the governor, and the governor again expressed his view that he was not a candidate.
Senator Walter Mahoney and Lieutenant Governor Malcolm Wilson were specifically mentioned as vice presidential possibilities in the conversation last night. Mahoney of New York, Lieutenant Governor Malcolm Wilson of New York, in order to hold the New York.
I do not know what names were specifically mentioned, and I wouldn't want to discuss the list.
This statement by Governor Rockefeller, does that represent a capitulation by the Vice President to Rockefeller's demands, and if so, why?
First place, it does not represent a capitulation on the part of either man. It represents an agreement between them. I think that if you read the statement, it's clear that this is a statement mutually agreeable to both people.
Interesting to note that Herb Klein and also Nelson Rockefeller later today both indicated that perhaps some agreement had been reached on a vice presidential nomination in that meeting in New York. At least both are now saying it is not appropriate for them to discuss the matter of the vice presidential nomination, whereas up until today they had been saying flatly, or indicating at least, that there was no decision as yet. We'll get more on that story in a little while when we hear from Nelson Rockefeller himself. One of the big results of that meeting in New York has been a rising of the conservatives here in Chicago. Spokesman for them is Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. He has assumed the role almost alone as the leading spokesman for the right, for the conservatives, for the forces which oppose Governor Rockefeller and his political philosophy. And so it became urgent for Senator Goldwater to stake his views about what seemed to be the Nelson Rockefeller rapprochement, and do it quickly and with his characteristic forthrightness. And he did so as the other principals stated their views through a news conference.
The unprecedented last-minute attempt to impose upon the Republican Platform Committee platform provisions from a point 1,000 miles away from the convention has caused deep concern on the part of conscientious Republicans attending the convention at Chicago. If a spokesman for the ultra-liberals is to be permitted to dictate the Republican platform, it seems logical that this same spokesman should become an announced candidate for the presidency and thus be prepared to assume the responsibility for carrying out the ultra-liberal provisions of his platform. What are we doing to the men and women of good conscience who have labored on the platform committee in Chicago for more than a full week if we now give in to this pressure and accept cut and dried platform provisions? Now, I thoroughly approve the Vice President's action in soliciting the thoughtful opinions of all Republicans in connection with the formulation of our platform. But if Governor Rockefeller is to be consulted in a secret meeting, then would it not also be proper for the Vice President to hold similar meetings with all Republican leaders and the thousands of Republican candidates who will be running on this platform? A great many working Republicans here in Chicago as delegates to this convention are now asking, did we come to Chicago to nominate a candidate for the presidency, or is our first concern to tailor our entire platform and adjust our historic principles in order to accommodate the conditions laid down by Governor Rockefeller as prerequisite to his becoming a candidate for the vice presidency? I have great confidence in the integrity of the men and women on the platform committee. I am encouraged by statements made to me by members of the platform committee during the noon recess today. Several members of the committee for whom I have the highest regard have assured me the Republican platform committee will write the provisions of the Republican platform and will refuse to accept this last-minute pressure tactic.
Do you view this platform proposal as being totally a Rockefeller proposal? After all, it was announced as an agreement between Nixon and Rockefeller.
The question is, do I consider this a total Rockefeller platform? No, my main objections to this incident is not so much what's said in the points that Nixon and Rockefeller have agreed upon, because there are some points in there that I could find myself in agreement with, but it's the method by which they've done it. Now, we have men and women assembled here in Chicago to write a platform. A platform is supposed to be a statement of the party's feelings about the problems of the country, a statement of party principles, not the statement of two men. And I think that these men and women gathered here are owed a little more respect than to have a secret meeting taking place in New York, during which a platform will be prepared that will take precedence over anything that they might arrive at themselves. I have heard, for example, I can't confirm this, but I have heard that the members of the subcommittee are opposed to federal aid to education. They have not been allowed to vote on that. I think that their feelings should be expressed in the platform, not the feelings of one or two men.
Senator,
Who has
the convention,
This gentleman.
Senator, if the convention bought what you call the ultra-liberal platform, could you campaign for it?
I couldn't conscientiously campaign for this platform that I have before me that was presented this morning, because there are several things in here that I was told yesterday by Mr. Nixon would not be in.
Would that mean you could not campaign for the ticket if they were running on that platform?
No, I would much rather have Dick Nixon as president than John Kennedy. I think most Americans in their right mind would.
You regard this agreement as a surrender by Nixon to Rockefeller, or that Nixon welcomes an opportunity to depart somewhat from the Eisenhower doctrine?
The question that Ms. Craig put is, do I feel that this is a surrender by Mr. Nixon to Mr. Rockefeller, or a desire to get away from the Eisenhower doctrines?
Desire by Nixon to depart somewhat from the Eisenhower doctrines.
A desire by Nixon to depart somewhat from the Eisenhower doctrines. I think it's a surrender to Rockefeller.
An estimate of why you think, in your words, Vice President Nixon surrendered to Rockefeller?
Would I hazard a guess as to why, in my words, Vice President Nixon surrendered to Rockefeller? Well, I don't know this to be true, but maybe some polls that have come out recently, or polls that are privately taken, might have shown the Vice President to have been slipping a little bit, which we would expect him to, immediately following a nationwide televised Democratic convention. Those who are of a timid nature in his camp might say, well, we have to take Rockefeller now in order to offset Johnson as a second place in the Democratic Party. That would be my guess more closely than anything.
Might be noted that Senator Goldwater, after that televised news conference, went back to his headquarters here in Chicago and drafted an even stronger statement about that Rockefeller-Nixon meeting, in which he called it immoral politics. He called it a sellout, appeasement of the Republican left, a Munich, and said that if these platform planks are adopted by the convention, would guarantee defeat in November. Well, after that almost all-night talk, Mr. Nixon returned to Washington and tried to catch up on some sleep at his Wesley Heights home. After that rest, he appeared before a news conference in the Capitol, a news conference which occurred almost at the same time that Governor Rockefeller was appearing before reporters here in Chicago. For a report on Mr. Nixon's Washington news conference, here is CBS News correspondent Wells Church.
After seeing Vice President Nixon and watching him this afternoon as he answered questions on his meeting with Governor Rockefeller, many who have watched Mr. Nixon perform under pressure before came away with the strong impressions, Walter, that Nixon made a command decision and has perhaps thereby changed the course of the 1960 Republican Convention and the campaign. Mr. Nixon was reported to be having trouble getting the platform he wants out there at Chicago, not because of Rockefeller, but because of the conservative wing of the party. And secondly, the intense activity on behalf of Governor Rockefeller, while it couldn't possibly have resulted in his nomination for the presidency, could create an appearance of a deep split in the party. And third, Nixon had to know once and for all whether Governor Rockefeller would take second spot on the GOP ticket. There was one place all these problems could be solved. All the answers would be there at a solid conference with Governor Rockefeller. Mr. Nixon knew Rockefeller to be closer to his own views than most people realized, and thus Nixon could close that gap, even though, as he said this afternoon, there remained some differences in detail. With both Nixon and Rockefeller demanding similar planks on the controversial issues, such as civil rights, aid to education, and old age health insurance, it was virtually certain, in Vice President Nixon's view, that he could get what he wanted in the platform and make it quite acceptable to Rockefeller at the same time. And finally, Vice President Nixon reasoned, we can settle the second place so far as we are concerned, which, of course, is what happened. Nixon, as you know, has now stated that he fully accepts Governor Rockefeller's refusal to run for the vice presidency, that he will not try to persuade Rockefeller to change his mind. And the next move, in the view of both men, is apparently up to someone other than Nixon will have to change Governor Rockefeller's mind. Now back to Walter Cronkite in Chicago.
When Nelson Rockefeller arrived or left the airport in New York for Chicago, he was swarmed over by reporters, as you might imagine. There he refused once again to endorse Vice President Nixon for the #1 spot on the ticket. He said he himself was still available if a genuine draft developed for him. Reporters, among others, repeated the crowd scene at the Chicago airport when he arrived here this afternoon. Here he is, debarking from his private aircraft with Mrs. Rockefeller and with his daughter Ann Tierson, married daughter. She's 26, and his twins, son Michael and daughter Mary, 21, are in that crowd.
Hey, Rocky! Rocky!
It was a tumultuous welcome he got.
I'm trying.
Signs reading, "We want a convention, not a coronation." The band played Dixieland numbers, including one that used to be a Democratic campaign song, "Happy Days Are Here Again." And as you hear, he is a jolly good fellow.
Ladies and gentlemen, the man who is better qualified to lead the great United States than any other man in all the world, uniquely qualified due to his very broad experience. So right now, ladies and gentlemen, if you please, a great, great, great cheer for the next President of the United States, the Honorable Nelson A. Rockefeller.
Well, then Rockefeller came to downtown Chicago. The governor hurried downtown from the airport. After a luncheon, held a news conference here at the headquarters hotel, the Conrad Hilton on Lake Michigan. It was almost so rumored that during his luncheon, the governor received a telephone call from the vice president. That was not confirmed, but it was said to have been a call from the vice president that he took in the private office of the manager of the restaurant where he lunched. What they talked about was not reported either, but the governor's news conference after lunch was the most heavily attended such function of the pre-convention week so far.
The statement is that made by Barry Goldwater, that the agreement reached between the Vice President and myself on the basic questions of the platform was a condition laid down by me for the Vice Presidential, as a prerequisite for a Vice Presidential nomination. The answer is flatly no. That, as has been mentioned, the question of the vice presidency was discussed at the meeting between the vice president and myself, and I reiterated my previous position that I would not be available under any circumstances for the vice presidency, and he reiterated his previously stated position that he would respect and honor my feelings on the matter. The question is, why don't I want the vice presidency? I think I can be of more service to people of the state of New York and people of the country as governor of the state of New York than I could as vice president.
Governor, who would you succeed the vice presidential?
The question is, whom would I suggest be the vice presidential candidate? I think that by tradition, by custom, and by logic, the man who is nominated for the presidency should be the person who selects his running mate, and that the rest of us would only be there to be consulted with on the subject. And therefore, if I had ideas on the subject, I would not express them because I think it would be inappropriate for me to do so.
Governor, did you and Mr. Nixon inform President Eisenhower of your 14 points, or did you let him find out about them for himself?
The question is, did Mr. Nixon, the Vice President, and I inform the President about the 14 points, or did we let him find out for himself? The answer is that the Vice President maintains very close contact with the President on all of these important matters, and that would be the natural and logical channel of contact on a matter of this kind.
Mr. Nixon has just said in Washington, Governor, that he still differs with you on defense issues and major foreign policies. How wide are those differences?
The statement is that the Vice President has just said in Washington that he still differs with me on major, did you say?
Defense issues.
Majors removed. On defense issues and foreign...
domestic issues.
And major domestic issues. And how wide is that difference? Well, the difference obviously is outside the 14 points that are expressed in the memorandum. Now, we've covered one already, which was the question of the means of coping with or financing old age pensions, which I mentioned, and you all know that my position is that sound financial approach to that is through the tried and proven system of old age and survivors insurance, contributory system, and the Vice President has been a strong supporter of the administration program. But we both agree on the basic objectives, and the methods of working those out within that framework, seems to me, is the kind of latitude which you'd expect to find in a party where you've got strong feelings and strong beliefs.
Governor, your supporters here are issuing various manifestos almost daily about Nixon. It'll be impossible for Nixon to win this November. Do you share this thesis?
The statement is that my supporters, perhaps we ought to call them the Draft Rockefeller Group, have been issuing almost daily manifestos to the effect that the Vice President couldn't win. Do I support this thesis? I haven't seen, to tell you the truth, and had a chance to read the statements that you're referring to. I've seen them referred to in headlines in the papers, not too big headlines, but referred to. Therefore, I'm not sure just exactly as to the details that are in those. I think that every Republican, as I've said before, is going to go out, particularly if you've got a platform such as the one that the Vice President and I have agreed on in broad terms, basic issues. If we've got that kind of a platform, that we're going to go out and fight as a party to win this election in the fall and leave no stones unturned to do it.
Governor, who has financed the draft Rockefeller movement here?
The question is, who has financed the draft Rockefeller movement? I don't know. What I'd suggest is you ask them.
Governor Rockefeller, by deciding not to run as the Vice President, do you think perhaps that might harm whatever possible presidential aspirations you might have for 64?
The question is whether by deciding not to run as Vice President I might have hurt whatever presidential aspirations I might have for 64. The real answer is I wouldn't know.
Governor?
Yeah.
Did you, why weren't the 14 points sent to the platform committee for its consideration before they were made public?
The question is, why weren't the 14 points submitted to the platform committee before they were made public? Well, you underestimate the ability of the group in this room. Frankly, I think that would have been an impossibility. But I would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, that the Vice President and I spent close to 3.5 hours on the phone last night with Chuck Percy here in Chicago, discussing with him and various members of the platform committee various of the issues which we were discussing among ourselves. There was a slight hiatus when at 1 o'clock this morning the switchboard operators went home, pulled all the wires out of the board, so it was about 20 minutes before we get together again. But except for that hiatus, we were in contact still.
Do you want to be president?
What was that?
Do you want to be president?
The question was, do I want to be president? I've said that should there be a genuine draft, which I thought was unlikely, that I would accept.
Governor, how long will you hold on to your draft status? Will you maintain that status until the night of the actual vote? Or is it possible you will make a decision of either to drop out or run fully before that?
The question is, how long will I hold on to my draft status? No, wait a minute. What would
available to a draft.
Available, my status as being available to a draft. And the answer to that, honestly, is I don't know.
Received in Washington of that news conference by Vice President Nixon, and we'll go there now for a look at it. He was asked the question, does today's activity rule out of consideration? And the Vice President gave this answer.
Well, I don't like to put it in terms of his being out, which would seem to be rather derogatory of him. I mean that actually this is a matter of mutual agreement. The governor indicates that he does not want to run for vice president, and I, as a potential candidate for the presidency, believe that his views should be respected. And may I say that I would have that same view with regard to any candidate for the vice presidency, because I know how hard it is to campaign. I know, despite that this job is supposed to be sometimes rather an easy one, how hard the job is, and I believe that if a person is going to run for vice president and be vice president, he's got to want to do it. The governor doesn't want to, and therefore I respect his views, and in that sense it's a closed book.
Of Affairs, the Vice President's statement was made before Governor Rockefeller's news conference here in Chicago. Since the Vice President made his statement you just heard, it has been reported by his office in Washington that he will have no further comment on Governor Rockefeller's press conference here tonight. Let's get a view of this day's proceedings now from Howard K. Smith.
Liberal Republicans have long maintained that General Dwight Eisenhower sold their party to the conservative right-wingers when he signed a document that Senator Robert A. Taft drew up at their celebrated conference at Morningside Heights in New York in the year 1952. And as you've just heard, conservative Republicans in Chicago are saying today that Richard Nixon sold the party back to the liberals in Manhattan in the small hours of this morning. Though some of the language in the 14 points that Nixon and Rockefeller agreed to is general, more of it fits recent Rockefeller speeches than fits recent Nixon speeches. For example, Mr. Nixon's last big speech was conspicuous for ridiculing what he called the parlor game of growthmanship. In today's platform document, the need for the economy to grow at a rate stated in the Rockefeller Brothers report is accepted with respect. Mr. Nixon's last big political act was a tie-breaking vote in the Senate this summer, killing a school aid bill. But today's document appears to favor such a bill. The 14 points come close to calling some recent administration policies supported by Mr. Nixon as not adequate. Point 1, for example, demands, and I quote, new and profound effort and action in all areas of American life. Point 2 says, and I quote again, the vital need of our foreign policy is new political creativity. And the 4th point says, new efforts are necessary in defense, for the facts of survival in the 1950s give no assurance of survival in the same military posture in the 1960s. And specific defense proposals contain measures the President has specifically rejected. The document answers one of the 2 questions that hang over this convention. The question is, what strategy would Nixon apply to try to get his minority party a majority of the votes? And the answer is, his strategy is going to be highly liberal. The other question that remains is, can Rockefeller be drafted to create the Nixon-Rockefeller dream ticket? The governor has said no 1,000 times, but there are still politicians in this city who think that an enthusiastic draft from the floor, plus some political pressure, could still do it. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
All right, Howard. One of the big problems right now here in Chicago faces the 103 members of the platform committee of the party. Their work over this last week may have to be tossed out the window for a great part to fit the 14-point declaration that came from New York City in the early hours this morning. The platform committee is going to meet at 8 p.m. tonight to undertake that work. They have until Wednesday to complete their work, however. That is when the platform is formally presented to this Republican convention. They will have to attempt in some way to reconcile the views of Senator Barry Goldwater and a considerable number of conservatives who follow his banner of conservatism in the party. Some of those people are from the southern states, and they have had meetings this afternoon among themselves to discuss what they can do to perhaps block some of the liberalism appearing in the new 14-point platform. They also are opposed to the civil rights platform, which they claim is far too liberal to gain Republican votes in the South. As far as Nelson Rockefeller's own political fortunes go, well, he meets with the New York delegation in caucus with its big 96 votes, the largest number in this convention, and presumably will decide at that meeting tomorrow night what his future course will be. There have been reports inside the New York delegation of resistance to Governor Rockefeller, attempts to break away from the pledge to him that the delegation has already given. However, other leaders of the delegation say that they will stay with Governor Rockefeller and that there is nothing else they can do in New York state politics. 2 of the leaders of the New York State group, however, Senator Kenneth Keating and the leader of the state Senate, the Republican leader, of course, Walter Mahoney, believe now that Governor Rockefeller's name definitely will not be placed in nomination on the presidential side. They see that as a result of the compromise agreement in New York early this morning. They do not say, however, that he will not to be offered as a vice presidential candidate, but they are sticking so far with Governor Rockefeller's own line that he is definitely not a candidate. The names of of the ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge, and of Senator Thurston Morton, the chairman of the party, are now most prominent in the ranks of those likely to be selected as the vice presidential nominee. Incidentally, President Eisenhower has no comment on the agreement made in New York today, nor has so far Senator Jack Kennedy of Massachusetts, the Democratic nominee for the presidency. We'll be returning tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time with our Convention Eve program, which will feature a visit to the home of Vice President Nixon. This is Walter Cronkite reporting from CBS Convention Headquarters in Chicago.